What's going on, guys? It's Adam P and welcome back to Benidorm. Believe it or not, today was meant to be an emergency scenario here in Costa Blanca. It was supposed to be a storm, 14 hours non-stop, from 10 in the morning to midnight, just non-stop rain. And areas, of course, along the beach like this, deemed a no-go zone. I'll never be more glad in my life to see that Storm Alice has decided to no-show. Good. Keep it that way. We're used to the no-show from Isak this summer, and now even the Storm's doing a no-show out here. Now we're here, of course, our joking aside, to talk about Newcastle United news. There's been quite a lot, I would argue, good news today. We now finally know who the new sporting director is going to be. And my personal opinion, why I actually believe Ross will do a good job at Newcastle. Third time lucky, and he's following in from two heavily disliked sporting directors at Newcastle. And why I actually think the club struck gold this time. I feel like, especially when you hear the name Ross Wilson, he's not someone that I think fans going to be jumping up for joy, but I actually think it's quite a smart move. Just as long as he stays put, as long as he doesn't snake out on us like Dan Ashworth, I actually think Newcastle is going to have their long-term successor here, and someone who is actually going to be helping Eddie Howe out, is going to be in there doing his job and just being able to help the club progress, because we've had a lot of workload over the summer, and I would argue a lot of unfair workload towards likes Eddie Howe as well, with all this additional manpower needing to be used. But we're here in this video to get to the bottom of it. Of course, if you guys are new around here, make sure to get down there, hit that subscribe button. Appreciate your support as always. I am back home over the weekend, which means we're going back into the flow of things, heading into the Champions League after the international break against Benfica. I can't wait for that, by the way. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of it. Question of the day: how many of you watching this video have been to Benidorm? When's the last time you've been here? I suppose it's my fourth time personally. Always a fairly chill holiday, easy to get to, and you know what, considering it's supposed to be a national health scare today, it's actually been quite sound, so I'm happy with that. Now, going into the video itself, we're going to start with the sporting directors, of course. Third time lucky coming in off Dan Ashworth. Unpopular opinion from Newcastle fans, I actually think Dan Ashworth was good at Newcastle. Just a massive snake, let's be honest. He was a huge snake. The guy goes on garden leave more than he actually works. He spent more days doing that garden. My word, his garden must be good, because that's all he ever does is go on garden leave. But he came to Newcastle, actually got with quite good players, and then completely snaked us out. Used club emails to actually contact our Premier League clubs trying to get the job secured. He clearly was looking for a way out of Newcastle. In my personal opinion, without digging in too much, I feel like Dan Ashworth might have expected to have more at Newcastle. Came in as a sporting director, of course, coming off from quite a successful time at Brighton. I personally believe that you imagine you would have had more control at Newcastle. Of course, with our ownership and our structure, it's quite controlled, so you have to go in and do your job. And Ashworth probably believed he would have had more of a role at Newcastle. He then snaked out, went to Manchester United, got himself sacked, so that hasn't went well for him at all. Paul Mitchell then came in, who, let's be honest, was terrible. Paul Mitchell was just not good at all. And local journalists even described Paul Mitchell as being a major instigator of why Alexander Isak kicked up a fuss over the summer. Journalists claimed that Paul Mitchell had turned down a new Isak deal, which would have made him our highest paid player. Clearly wasn't interested in giving Isak more money at the time. That's then led to that player kicking up a fuss, going on strike, and we had that huge nightmare over the summer, which I would argue is still somewhat damaging Newcastle now, because we've replaced him. Mortimer's amazing, but you've got Wissa there, who's also injured, so you still only got one striker, and Newcastle still is in a situation where you got a bit of a hangover, perhaps, from the Isak stuff, because we're still talking about him, we're still seeing it on social media, and while I would say it's all in the past now, we can move forward and we can progress and do that, it still is a case where we as fans, and I think the football club, is just keeping an eye on him, just seeing and hoping that he doesn't do well at Liverpool. But going away from that, Paul Mitchell was crap at his job. That's the point. Paul Mitchell was absolutely rubbish at his job. And now we're looking at a situation where you've got Ross coming in from Nottingham Forest, who I actually believe is quite a good appointment. I think when you see the name and you see the background of the sporting director, I almost feel like it's a bit of a, perhaps, fans not being as excited as they should be for him, but I actually think he's quite a good appointment. He's done work at Huddersfield and Southampton during the 2010s, not as a sporting director. His first sporting director role was at Rangers during their boom period Of course, the invincible season with Stephen Joe and won the Scottish Premiership. You could argue Rangers' best period in the reinception in the last 15 years since, of course, they came back in 2010. I'll probably argue that is Rangers' best period. And then he went to Nottingham Forest afterward in what was 100% their best period, got themselves back into European football, being a competitive side. If you want to look at a negative spin on things, they did have a points deduction during that time, which, of course, Ross would have been hands-on with. But other than that, had also quite a good time at Forest. He just came off the back of two good jobs at clubs you could argue were rebuilding. Rangers have rebuilt into a better team. Forest rebuilt into a better team. Now you're at Newcastle, a team that's already rebuilt, but you're rebuilding them into being an absolute juggernaut in European football. And he's had two successful jobs coming into Newcastle, so I have to say, I think it is a good appointment. It's not like he's done this at Championship clubs or clubs that are insignificant. He's done this at two quite well-registered clubs as well. So I think he deserves the job. I think he's got the opportunity there, just as long as he's not a snake and he plans on sticking around long-term. Because as a sporting director, you have to be invested in the project and you have to stick with it and be fully invested in everything Newcastle does. If he does that, he's got a real opportunity to succeed in here. Has to be the one this time, though. You have three failed sporting directors and we have a real problem. This one has to work. You can't have three of them failing for you after the takeover. So I'm hoping Ross can come in and do the job. But it's now starting to be pushed out from journalists that he will be appointed as a sporting director. Will he do the job? Will he be the one? I sure hope so, because I feel like it's almost on repeat. Me bigging up these sporting directors and then for them just to flop and ditch Newcastle. So I'm hoping this one will do the job. But I actually do think it's quite a good appointment. And finally, during the international break, has there been a social media agenda towards Newcastle where you got people in the media bigging up our staff members, bigging up our players in an attempt to try and turn their heads or an attempt to try and get these opposition teams to give it a real go. Paul Scholes has obviously been speaking quite well about Sandro Tonali. I do believe this agenda thing to some extent, because I think last season, especially Isak, every single week you got these social media pages, these companies continuing to describe him going to Arsenal. It would have been during the time, and you kind of got this same question every week. He's too good at beating Newcastle. We need to let him go. Newcastle needs to sell this player. And then you got Eddie Howe as well. You got Paul Scholes going into detail about Eddie Howe, saying that he would love Eddie Howe to replace Amrin at Manchester. At least he's not deluded enough to say and to suggest that it is going to happen. At least he said it's never going to happen, but that would be my perfect choice to go for. Which, I mean, yeah, is a fair enough comment. I think he is entitled to say something like that. And I would actually argue at times there's normally some cases out there where you see an example like that, but actually delude enough to suggest that Manchester United should go and get Eddie Howe, even though it's never ever going to happen. But I wanted to pinpoint Paul Scholes, because we talked about this yesterday, but especially his comments towards Sandro Tonali. I do believe this to some extent in social media. I think I wouldn't be surprised at all actually to suggest that over the next few weeks, and every time Newcastle plays, it will be Tonali this, Tonali that. It'll be a continued push towards Sandro Tonali, and you just see the media pages turn their heads and talk solely about him going, well, Newcastle, they're not going to keep this player for much longer. He wants to go back to Italy. He's going to go to a better Premier League club. And just all this noise and all this drama about Newcastle not being a big enough club to keep a hold of a player like Tonali. And it sounds like a thing you just hear non-stop, because it is. I think you will see that in social media, and I would argue, while not wanting to spend the entire video directly talking about it, I'd certainly think there is a social media agenda towards. I would argue these smaller clubs and clubs that aren't this big six mold not being able to keep a hold of good players. I mean, Newcastle is a good team, and Newcastle, you could argue, is probably better than half the big six anyway. So for where we are now, Newcastle is a club that we've just got to deal with this noise. We had this noise last season. Unfortunately, in the end, I think, I wouldn't say the noise did it, but our players' head was turning and decided to go elsewhere. Newcastle has to avoid this again. Next summer, I stand by players like Tonali, players like Gordon. You're going to have to just make sure you can just keep them tight, keep them into this football club, and make sure that these clubs don't come in for them, because you're always going to have a hard time every season, especially if you don't have Champions League football. I think getting European football is the main priority for Newcastle, but if you don't get Champions League football, that is the level some players will want to play at every single year. We'll see what happens this season. The club's definitely got a possibility of doing it. I would argue maybe maybe a big ask to do it, but it certainly is possible. Newcastle's doing well. Just need to hopefully get Whistler back as soon as possible and then be able to move on from there. But the question and the point of this part of the video was to ask whether or not there is a social media agenda towards our staff members and players, and just trying to, in the background, subtly almost whispering to them, and just to try and perhaps get clubs out there to just come in and buy our players up. And I would actually say yes, I think there is. I wouldn't say it's just a Newcastle thing, but it's so heavily targeted towards Newcastle. You just see it all the time, and I think especially after seeing the Easter stuff every single week last year, I think there is a thing to it. I think social media pages love to get attention, love to get a reaction from Newcastle fans, and I'd argue you're going to see a lot of this season, especially with a player like Tonali. I would not be surprised at all. Every single week you'll just hear something about it. But hope you guys have enjoyed watching the video today. Just wanted to talk you through, of course, the new sporting director, and just talk you through this social media noise I've been hearing a lot this week, and I'm sure you guys as well are going to be hearing all over, whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whatever it may be, you're going to hear it non-stop. So let me know down in the comment section, do you believe in that? Do you think it's a thing, or do you think I'm maybe looking into it too much? Let me know your opinions. Appreciate your support anyway. Don't mind me, I'm going out and enjoying myself today, so appreciate your support, and we will see you all in the next one.